Hello everyone, Eric here, also known as the Nascent Nimrod, and I have come before you today with a series of questions. What role should fear play in our society? What role should fear play in the society we are trying to create? What role should fear play in our attempts to bring that society to fruition? And finally, why am I talking about this now? The short answer to that last question is Halloween is over. I think now is the time to be able to consider the topic with minds unclouded by merrymaking and the commercialism of that season. So where are we at? I recently found a video by Non-Compete, link in the description, wherein he similarly discussed fear, specifically on the political left. He starts off by recounting a story about a friend of his who was afraid of a child who often stood on the other side of the street from her house, ominously to her mind, bouncing a basketball.
And, as you've probably guessed, yes, the kid was black, and yes, my friend was white.
He goes on to describe her fear as a type of false consciousness. If you are unfamiliar with the term, know that it is often employed in discussions of critical theory and other Marx-adjacent movements, and it refers to a phenomena wherein, and I quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica, members of the proletariat unwittingly misperceive their real position in society and systematically misunderstand their genuine interests within the social relations of production under capitalism. So why does he say this? To him, her fear was a product of racism, and those racist narratives are created and perpetuated under capitalism in order to put up roadblocks to class solidarity. I don't necessarily disagree with this interpretation, but listen to his description of what his friend experienced.
My friend, who was in her mid-20s and quite liberal, lived in fear of a 12-year-old kid for several weeks, which seems ridiculous. It was ridiculous, just like many of the fears that we have.
Now he goes on to say that fear can be a powerful motivator, especially with respect to politics, but he calls her fear ridiculous. The video goes on to make several other salient points about how fear is used by authoritarian/fascist forces to control the masses and increase false consciousness. It then circles back around to the land back discussion that we had a few weeks ago. As a quick refresher, there was some dialogue back then about whether land back, the idea that indigenous people should hold sovereignty over their traditional lands as a means of decolonization, should still be supported if it means moving large numbers of non-native, read, white people off of their land. At the time, that forced migration was likened by Vaush, premier leftist internet debater, and others of his ilk, to genocide. And when presented with the question of whether or not she would support that genocide, Lua, more broadly known on the online left as Professor Flowers, responded by saying that, and I'm paraphrasing here, she thought genocide was bad, but that she would support indigenous people's right to make decisions they deemed necessary. Now in this video, Non-Compete likens the idea of natives going through the process of decolonization to the way the French and then the Americans were defeated and removed from Vietnam. Take a listen and pay attention to the language he uses regarding the fear people have about reprisal.
That's the difference between being colonized and having self-determination. So the two things that really bother me about this trend in rhetoric are, number one, it's based on complete hypothetical fear of the oppressed. And number two, it centers white people as hypothetical victims, again, rooted in this kind of fear of the hypothetical. Whether or not it's appropriate to kick out settlers like the Vietnamese did is based purely in the material conditions of the time.
So let's take a moment to break down his critique of the land back discussion. One, it is rooted in what he calls a hypothetical fear of the oppressed. If I am to read this statement with as much charity as possible, I think he means that any fear of reprisal from indigenous actors is unfounded, as it focuses on what he views as a possible but unlikely scenario. He admits later that, of course, action taken at the time will be dictated by material conditions, but fear of that situation is unwarranted for the non-Indigenous. Second, he doesn't like the idea of white people taking focus, as victims or otherwise, in a discussion on Indigenous rights. I won't argue that second point if that's the way he feels, but I question the coherency of the first. He seems to criticize people for being afraid of a possible scenario, but surely it is reasonable for one to be afraid of a possible scenario. It would be unreasonable to be afraid of an impossible one. The counter-argument is, of course, that your fear should be proportional to the likelihood of a particular event taking place. But when we say should in that instance, what is our purpose? Are we attempting to make some group or another pay a social price for not following this precept? That does in fact seem to be the case with the way that non-compete describes it. In this case, his motivation seems to be to chastise debate bro leftists and shame anyone who identifies on the left who may have these fears of the oppressed. My criticism is that his motivation and the framing he adopts to suit this motivation are unproductive on the whole. My assertion is that fear, which we here recognize as the primary means of control of the fascist, is not waylaid by being dismissive, by attempting to shame the people who exhibit it, or indeed by responding to questions about a future mass relocation like this.
At this point, nobody is considering kicking all the white South Africans out, so it's absurd to bring it up. If things develop to the point where that comes to be some kind of possibility in the material world, then it's impossible to say whether or not it will be appropriate or not at that time because it's a future scenario and we can't predict the future. It's just like asking the question, is it acceptable to kill somebody? The only rational answer to that question is maybe.
Fear, rational or irrational, has to be met with understanding, and if it stands in the way of coalition building, then it needs to be overcome with frank discussion and a comprehensive plan that will make all parties involved feel comfortable. I understand that non-compete feels that the moral questions are intrinsically tied to material conditions present at any given time, but when you are given the opportunity to state a moral position, like Lua was, and like he is in this video, you are essentially making a claim about your intentions and future actions so that the listener will be able to trust you. It may be true that there is some such circumstance in the future when you would engage in a killing, i.e. for self-defense, like in the example he gives later, but if someone asks you, do you support murder? It is inappropriate at that time to give an ambiguous answer to a question that is clearly meant to elicit an assurance about your general behavior or the behavior of any particular group in question. To do otherwise simply increases the apprehension of the fearful, builds the ego of the debate bro, and puts off the general public. In short, fear is a very real motivator to human thought and behavior. But we have to be careful that our means of addressing it don't increase its power over people's lives. Well, that's my take on the matter. If you have anything to add or a disagreement to air, please do so down in the comments. Have a good day.